Welcome to Study Loop.
For this question, we have an experiment where scientists have nutritional wells and they are inoculating them with cultures of yeast. So you can imagine that over time, the yeast is slowly going to descend towards the bottom of the tube by gravity. After a while though, the scientists are going to grab the colonies at the bottom and introduce them to a new well, where again they're going to do the same thing. They're going to allow the yeast to settle for a short while and grab the colonies that come along the bottom. So here, it's important to look at the qualities that cause them to descend or settle faster. So here, the cells that are going to settle faster are going to be those that are in clusters rather than singular organisms, and our larger clusters are going to settle faster than, say, a smaller cluster. So here, we are selecting for the formation of clusters and for the formation of larger clusters. So the scientists conduct this transfer of the yeast about 60 times for the life cycle of the yeast. And what they noticed is originally they had started with single cellular yeast, and by the end they have multicellular yeast. So these are connected together and they are working collectively in order to survive better. So basically they are selecting the organisms that are more apt to form the clusters and are more likely to form these multicellular structures. So for the questions this experiment is proposing, we can start with A, where they're asking about how this applies to evolution as an ongoing stimulus, either with a strong force or a weak force. Strong being they only gave the yeast about 5 minutes to settle. This means they're picking the most extreme presentation of this clustering and large cluster formation. Whereas in the weak pressure, they're allowing about 25 minutes for the yeast to settle. So some of the yeast they may collect at the bottom after 25 minutes may not have strong genetic disposition to cluster or form larger clusters. So here they're selecting more for less extreme or more common forms of those clusters or those larger formations. However, what these propose is that evolution can occur in any type of stimulus being provided that an organism has to adapt to. So what this means is if there's some sort of stimulus in the environment that an organism needs to adapt to better survive, they're going to see some sort of shift in the genetic display in the population in order to form these more favorable clusters and a more favorable species that survives better in that environment. For part B, they're asking us about how the adaptation to become multicellular can be beneficial or can be a deficit to the whole population. So here, the advantages of being multicellular is the organisms are working together in that cooperative behavior. So this increases the survival of multiple organisms. Whereas the disadvantages is this is going to decrease the display of individual genes. So you're no longer going to have as much genetic variations because you can imagine in the beginning you have 3 sets of gene pools in each of these organisms, whereas in the very end you're collecting these organisms together and these are going to share that similar gene pool. So here you're decreasing the amount of variability inside of the species or organism, and you are limiting the amount of variations or mutations they can pick up. And that can limit their ability to adapt and change to the environment and survive as the population of a whole. However, you are increasing the survival of basically the species through this method, because you're not going to have all the organisms fail to meet the standards and adaptations they need to live, because they are working together in order to survive. So really, multicellular organisms increase the survivability of these species, but it's going to decrease their survivability of individuals. So to some extent, it's an advantage that at least the species gets to survive and extend and replicate its genes into further generations, but this limits the individuality and the variations of species that can arise from it. But that's better than the species completely dying off and becoming extinct.